When I say Gaia cards, I am referring only to cards that are shared by both Republic and aliens. Cards that are only in the Republic or only in the alien faction are not included when I say this term, even though they are both technically on Gaia. I'm only talking about the cards that both of them can use. I would also like to apologize to the card Exhaust. I said it was a decent card that didn't really fit in with the alien archetype, and oh boy was I wrong. Especially after the nerf of Faceless Saint and Swarm becoming more prevalent, Exhaust is a 2-soul powerhouse. It's essentially a 12-second stun on the enemy Guardian and any other port of enemy units that get stuck in its field. Please, use Exhaust. Now, with that out of the way, let's start analyzing. First up is Leon. Leon is a 4-cost melee legendary unit with a pretty large HP pool and a lot of single target damage. Whenever an enemy unit spawns, Leon will fire a bolt towards where they spawn to deal a large amount of damage, starting at around 300. The bolt he fires goes all the way across the field until it leaves past the border of the field and will damage every enemy it touches, including structures and guardians. If you summon a swarm unit and spread them out, it'll only fire towards one of the units, so if you play Terminites and spread them out perfectly, the detect will only kill one, and you'll still have 7 Terminites. The skill says it has a 2-second cooldown, but that's false. If you rapidly play units, then Leon will rapidly fire bolts. He's a great unit to include in both Republic and Alien decks. Next up is Nikola. Nikola is a ranged legendary unit that when played will deal damage and stun units in a pretty large area around themselves. The stun will last for 2 seconds. When they die, they do the exact same thing, dealing damage and stunning nearby enemies. Nikola's HP isn't all that great, and it attacks fairly slowly, so even though it has a high damage per attack, it still doesn't do all that much damage, but its Battlecry and Death Rattle abilities are amazing. Nikola is a great, oh shit, please save me card when there's tons of units that are beating up your Guardian. Another great card that's a great addition to both Republic and Alien decks. Next up, we have Goliath. Goliath is a melee legendary unit that is a little squishy but does a fairly large amount of damage. Every second, they'll lose a small amount of HP, but they'll regain a large amount of HP and permanent attack speed, stacking up to 50% maximum when they kill a unit. Personally, I'm not a fan of Goliath. They're a decent unit, but the soul cost seems high, and they'll lose if they run into certain units like Xenoclaw or even an Engineer, which are lower in cost. However, after the nerf of Faceless Saint, low-cost cards for Sense decks in the Eden factions will likely be much more popular, and Swarm cards in all factions will become much more usable. So it is possible that Goliath will become a lot stronger due to the shift in meta, and there's also structures that like Igloom from the Beast faction and Faceless Altar from the Eden factions that Goliath is very strong against. Next we have Tadakatsu. Tadakatsu is a legendary melee unit that is very squishy and does okay damage, although it's low damage for his soul cost. Where he shines, though, is that when you play him, he will teleport to a random enemy unit and kill all nearby enemy units. What this means is that when the enemy has a Hilda and a Mumford right next to each other, heading towards your Guardian, you can play a Tadakatsu and have him teleport to the Tubby that just spawned from the enemy Guardian and cry as you accidentally wasted your 6-soul removal legendary card. And you still have a double tank push headed right for your Guardian. In all seriousness, no, Tadakatsu is a great removal card that can net you a huge soul advantage, but you have to be careful when you play him, as it does go to a random enemy unit. If you have him, I would recommend you play him for now, although just like the opposite of what's happening with Goliath because of the shift in meta, it's kind of going away from tanks at the moment, is what it looks like, so Tadakatsu could become much less stronger. Moving on to the epic cards, we are starting with Hotshot. Hotshot is a 4-cost ranged unit that deals a fair amount of damage at the start and is a little beefy compared to other ranged DPS units. Every time Hotshot attacks, they gain damage that keeps stacking, but that stacking damage will disappear when they're out of combat for more than 2 seconds. Hotshot's a great card that you can use in most decks and is amazing when enemies play a structure that spawns units such as Igloom or the Faceless Altar that was mentioned earlier. Next we have Minor Mech. Minor Mech is a 7-cost melee unit with a very large HP pool and surprisingly good damage. When played, he has a long time before he'll actually start moving and swinging, a whole 10 seconds. Depending on the situation, this could be good or bad. In all honesty, I'm not really a fan of Minor Mech. Republic and Alien are both factions that haven't really used big tanks, and Minor Mech can only really be used for starting a big push due to his large deploy time. He's not a good reactionary card, and so he's not very versatile. I would say Minor Mech isn't a bad card, but I never really got any good results using it. Moving on to the rares, we're starting off with Missile Turret. Missile Turret is a 3-cost structure where all it does is fire missiles that do a large amount of damage to enemy units when they spawn, just like Leon's ability. Some people run it, and I used it for a bit. Personally, I'm not really impressed by it. There are situations where it can be useful, but most of the time it just eats up space in my hand where I could have had a better card. If the enemy has a push coming to your Guardian, then this card can't really do anything to help you in that situation. Next is Prism Turret. Prism Turret is a 4-cost structure that lasts only 20 seconds, 10 seconds less than normal for a structure, and it fires at enemies from almost as long of a range as Sniper. And every time it fires, it'll gain more and more damage until it switches targets. So it's a good tank killer. I'm not a fan of cards that can't really be used offensively, so I don't like to use it. You could play it in a place where it'll fire at the enemy tank that's on the other side of the field, although it'll be somewhat close to the border, so the enemy could play units that could just walk up and kill it. Also, again, with the shift in meta, there's going to be a lot more swarm units, so I don't know if this will be as useful. People have used it with varying degrees of success against me, so you feel free to try it, but personally I wouldn't recommend it. Next up is Bloodbloom. Bloodbloom is a 4-cost structure that regains HP when it kills an enemy. Don't use this card. Next up is Demolisher. Demolisher is a 5-cost melee siege unit with a large amount of HP and considerable damage. It cannot be slowed by the enemy. Demolisher is a pretty good siege unit, about as good as Rabid, maybe even a bit better. I personally don't use it as I don't like expensive siege units, but it's a good card. Next up is Riphorn. Riphorn is a 5-cost melee unit with a fair amount of HP and large damage. After being out of combat for about 0.8 seconds, it gains increased movement speed and deals a large AoE damage to the next target hits and stuns them for 5 seconds. I don't really like this card. It honestly just feels really bad. I laugh whenever the enemy plays one because it just doesn't do anything to me. It's really easy to block with properly positioned swarm units too, so it's very easy to counter. Moving on to the common cards, we'll be starting with Arachling. Arachlings are a 1-cost common card that are super squishy and deal very little damage, but there are 3 of them, so that damage isn't really that horrible for a 1-cost. Republic and Alien both don't have any units with Sense, so 1-costs seem a bit weaker here than they would be for Eden. But they are very good at catching Painlings and War Pigs, or you could use them to lure your enemy units to their demise. It's a pretty decent card. I wouldn't use more than 2 if you do decide to use them, though. Next up, we have Medi-bots. Medi-bots are a 2-cost support unit that are unable to attack and instead heal allied units. Some people use them. I personally don't. Together, at level 5, the 2 Medi-bots will heal for 158 HP. This is half of the damage a troop of Marines would do without their Battlecry buff, so I believe it's more efficient to just play a damage unit of the same cost instead. If you and the enemy both have minor mechs at the same level, hitting each other in the center of the field, and then let's say they played Medi-bots and you played Marines and no other cards are played in this situation, you would win with the Marines. So that's why I don't really use Medi-bots. Next up, we have Landmine. Landmine is a 2-cost structure that cannot be targeted. It self-destructs when an enemy comes into the range around it, and it'll deal a large amount of damage to nearby enemies. It takes 3 seconds for it to be usable after playing. I personally don't use it. I feel like there are better ways to deal AoE damage like Catapods, Venomites, Grenadier, etc. So it's not in my deck, personally. Which, speaking of, next is Catapod. Catapod is a 3-cost ranged AoE unit that is very squishy, but has a very far range and deals a lot of damage. It's very useful for banking on your side of the field for a while and just waiting for the enemy while it engages with other units. It's a good DPS card. Next up, we have Sentinels. Sentinel is a 3-cost melee tank card that I honestly forgot existed. It has a decent amount of HP and a bit of damage, but personally I wouldn't really use it. It just seems to not do as good as other cards. Next up is Shotgunner. Shotgunner is a 4-cost melee card that is pretty beefy and deals really good AoE damage. Overall, it's just a really good card. That's all I really have to say for it. Feel free to use it. I use it in my deck. Alright, after that we have Armor Pod. Armor Pod is a 4-cost melee unit with good HP and lowish damage. As far as tanks go, it seems fairly useless as it dies to range units rather quickly due to it being slow, and it's not so big HP pool. It's a lot of HP for a 4-cost, but overall it's not a lot of HP, so it just kind of doesn't do much. I wouldn't really recommend using it. Last and just barely not least, we have Penetry. Penetry is a 5-cost structure that lasts for 20 seconds and attacks from very far, and its attack penetrates through units, but don't use it. If it weren't for Bloodbloom, this would be the worst card in the game. Just don't use it. So that finishes up the Gaia cards. I hope my analysis was helpful. I'll be taking a break from this analysis series for a little bit. In the last week, there have been some slight meta shifts, rebalances, and I've gained a lot more knowledge about the game and cards in general. So due to all these different factors, the decks I've been using have been changing over time. And I would like to make some new videos for each faction where I go over the decks for that faction and maybe give some gameplay and tips and whatnot. So if that's something you want to see, make sure you subscribe and click that little bell looking thing so you'll get notified whenever my videos come out. Best of luck climbing.